Yeah, I'm Humair Iqbal. I'm a research analyst here, and I work on the India desk, basically. And these are all my colleagues at the institute, and they all have their own desk. Um, I'm really pleased and honored to have you with us today as a distinguished scholar in an eminent speaker series to delve upon the pertinent subject of interest from your perspective on where India and the United States relationships are headed under the Trump administration. So I'll start with a brief introduction of yours for my colleagues. Dr. Harsh Pant is the Vice President at Observer Research Foundation, New Delhi. He's a professor of international relations with King's India Institute at King's College London. He's also director of Delhi School of Transnational Affairs at Delhi University. And besides having a distinguished academic career in India, Professor Pant has also been a non resident fellow with the Wadhwani Chair in US India Policy Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Washington, D.C., and an Emerging Leaders Fellow at the Australia India Institute, University of Melbourne. Professor Harsh's current research is focused on Asian security issues, if I'm not wrong. And so you have authored a number of notable books. The most recent books include India and Global Governance, A Rising Power and Its Discontents, Politics and Geopolitics, Decoding India's Neighborhood Challenge, America and the Indo-Pacific, Trump and Beyond. There are many other also, but with this introduction, sir, I very warmly welcome you and invite you to share your insights on the subject, and the floor is all yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Iqbal. And I hope I am audible. My voice is a bit low today, but I hope I'm able to convey.
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for it's always wonderful to be able to talk to fellow colleagues, and particularly from Pakistan, which one does not get a lot of chance to engage with. So it's wonderful that at least virtually one can connect. And this is a topic which is perhaps in some ways also very generic, that if you just remove India from the title, I think every other country is trying to figure out what they want to do with and how to manage Mr. Trump. So it's while my exposition would be on India and how what India has been trying to do or India might do, or what are the potential possibilities and in the relationship over the next 4 years. But I think the larger issue for international relations today is framing Mr. Trump and his response to a lot of the global questions. And he himself has declared, that he's the great disruptor. So we don't have to overanalyze his ideas, because he himself claims that he wants to disrupt the global order in some ways. Now it is very interesting because analytically, if you think about it, as students of international relations, as students of as those of us who study international politics, there has been a consistent theme in international politics. We all have used it in terms of our framing, whichever part of the world we study, whichever theme we study, whichever domain we study, where we look at America as the exploiting country. That America is the hegemon. America is a malign hegemon. Most of the times we have argued, look, America takes advantage of other countries. America is there are often it is said, oh, America is not reliable, it is not trustworthy, so what and we have all used it in some of our works. If you study IR, if you write on IR, I'm sure all of us would have written something along these lines. How America uses international system to its advantage, how it uses other nations to its advantage, etc. Now, what Mr. Trump has done, which is so remarkable about him, is that he has inverted this prism. He's saying everyone else, international system included broadly, is taking advantage of the US. That it is the US which is at the receiving end of the system. that it is the US that is that is getting short shifted, that is getting that is getting shortchanged. It is US that is that is being taken advantage of. And this is again, I mean, if you think about it, uh, what is there to argue with it? I mean, what can you do with it? I mean, if I tell Americans that you take advantage of India, or you say you take advantage of Pakistan, and he comes back and he says, well, no, you take advantage of the US. Now there is no negotiation there. We are stuck. So, in a sense, what he has done, he has very cleverly put the rest of the world on the defensive. Now, you cannot go to Mr. Trump and argue as most countries used to do in the past. We all used to lecture Americans that, look, America, you are at fault, you are the great hegemon, you are the great problem in the world, every problem emanates from you, you do this, you do that. He's saying none of that. I don't want to listen to it. You are the problem, and I am at a loss because America has been shortchanged. America has been receiving all the disadvantages of the global economic order in particular, and I don't want to be part of this order. I want to invert that order. Now, we may all laugh at it, we may all think it is highly cynical, but this is what it is. And in international relations, you have to, most of the policy issues emanate from dealing what the system is. I mean, we can all think of an ideal world, but we don't operate in an ideal world. So the world that exists at the moment is a world that is being defined by Mr. Trump, who is inverting the prism through which we analyze the world. So our old, the old sort of frameworks that we have become so used to, they need to change. If you have to work through the system, and if you have to analyze Mr. Trump, if you have to for if even if you have to provide some policy prescriptions. So it's quite an extraordinary moment in that sense in the global order, that everyone used to say American unipolarity is a problem, America is a problem. Now he's saying, well, I don't want to be unipolar. Please take responsibility. I don't want America to lead the world. I am at a disadvantage. I don't want global economic. I don't want economic globalization, and so you better adjust to it. Now everyone is scrambling. Now everyone is saying, oh, what to do, suddenly every Europeans are anxious, suddenly the Chinese are worried, suddenly Indians are also worried, suddenly you have countries big and small looking at Mr. Trump and figuring out what to do with him. But that is how he has framed the discussion, that if America first is going to be the mantra that he's going to follow, then that America First model would demand that he would ask questions from other countries as to what those countries, what the interlocutors, what American interlocutors can do for the US. So the question is no longer what America can do for you. The question is what you can do for the US. And that's a remarkable shift in the discourse that is happening. Every single leader you would have observed in the last few decades, sorry, in the last few months, last 2 months, last 1 month, in fact, who has gone to Washington, he has gone with things that he or she can do. So whether it is Emmanuel Macron recently, whether it was Mr. Modi, whether it was Japanese Prime Minister, whether it was Jordan's leader, all of them went with a list of things. Say, yes, yes, we are willing to do this for you. So in a way, Mr. Trump has disrupted the system and our own ability to manage it, because he's asking some challenging questions which a lot of the countries don't have answers to. That for a long time we have relied on the US for so many things, and we have taken its presence in certain respects for granted, that now when he's shaking it up, we are all scrambling for a response. And this is particularly visible in the context of Europe, which is really in one of the most difficult positions that it has ever been since the end of the Second World War. But this is the larger frame that I wanted to sort of put before you, before I come to the India US question in particular. Now, India-US relationship, I'll just give a brief conceptual overview, because since the end of the Cold War, there has been a transformative change in India-US relationship. The relationship has grown, the relationship has expanded, the relationship has deepened, and this has happened across leaders, across administrations, both in India and in Washington. Whether we have had Republicans or the Democrats, or MAGA Republicans like Mr. Trump, or we have had in India Congress, BJP, whatever party in power. or even coalition governments. I think one standard strain of foreign policy response has been to build relationship with the US, and that relationship has continued to grow. Now, if you are conceptualizing it in terms of what are the factors, broadly, you can divide them into three. One, of course, is very fundamentally the structural realities of the world. And I think once the Cold War ended, the American focus shifted from Eurasia to Asia, and from Europe to Asia, from transatlantic relations to Asia. And in that context, we saw how the lens through which India was being viewed started changing. So during the Cold War, the lens was India, Pakistan. Post Cold War, the lens became India, China, and that meant that for Americans, the idea that India is going to play a significant role in the emerging balance of power in Asia became something which was gradually being subsumed in their assessment of how the balance of power is changing. You see it for the first time explicitly articulated in George W. Bush administration when Condoleezza Rice, even before she was part of the administration, before the election of George W. Bush, she started expanding on this argument, or she wrote in Foreign Affairs this article about how India needs to be looked at through an Asian lens rather than through a South Asian lens, because India has the potential to shape the larger balance of power in the region. So that thread which emerged from there continued to evolve over a period of time. And today you see that in the context of the debate on the Indo-Pacific. You see it in the context of the debate on how certain kinds of configurations are emerging in the region, like Quad, for example. You see it in the context of how Indian Ocean and Pacific Oceans are being looked at as one contiguous maritime zone, and how American policy has responded to those imperatives. So, in a sense, the structural shift post the end of the Cold War propelled the US to look at India differently. And India, of course, in the end of the Cold War, was looking uh, at a world that had dramatically shifted. India's partner and India's ally, strategic ally, Soviet Union, had disappeared, and so India had to build relationship with the West. India had to diversify its defense supplies. India had to build its economy. So that partnership with the US became an imperative for India as well. Excuse me. So India's response to the structural change was also quite significant, and I think that is what the balance of power element and angle became very important for both countries. And if you look at that thread, you still see the balance of power issues, the structural uh, factors being very, very important in that dynamic, because structural factors, those of us who study international relations, also bring to the fore this idea that uh, in some ways they transcend domestic politics. That whether you have a Congress party in power, or a BJP in power, or a coalition government in power, whether you have Republicans or Democrats in power, it doesn't matter. If you have the structural engagement, if you have the structural factors driving the relationship is likely to continue, and that in some ways has happened with the relationship. Now, this brings me to the second element, if the second level of analysis, if you will, which is domestic politics. And in that sense, also what you started seeing was that across the political divide in India and the US, uh, you started looking at a core which developed in strategic core that developed in both countries, that started calling for more robust India-US relationship. So while there are many in India who still are suspicious of American motivations, while there are still many in the US who still are suspicious of India, the core bureaucratic dynamic has shifted, and that meant that the domestic institutional change and the domestic political change was mobilized for this relationship, and continued to be part of building of this relationship. One example is that again, across governments you see a very significant investment in this relationship. The third element is, of course, normative, which are certain norms or certain values that propel this relationship. It is often said that, look, there are two democracies that work together, etc., etc. Now, sometimes it is over exaggerated. Democracies, India was a democracy even during the Cold War, and but the relationship was subpar, below par. But I think the fundamental change in American position on what is now called the rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific that started emerging in the last decade and a half. That allowed a number of countries, including India, to work with the US on a normative frame of reference for the Indo-Pacific, and that meant that certain issues which perhaps were problematic before could be worked through this idea of what are the normative underpinnings of this relationship. So while democracy is often used to talk about the relationship. There are other issues, other norms which perhaps are more important in this engagement, and one of them being this idea of a rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific. So, in a sense, if you are looking at the India-US relationship since the end of the Cold War, a number of factors have been propelling this relationship structurally, domestic politically, normatively. There has been investment top down in the relationship. So you see top leaders investing in the relationship. You see if you look at the leaders at the leader level engagement, you can pick any leader from India and you can pick any leader from George W. Bush onwards. All of them investing significant diplomatic capital on India. Uh, and from India's side, all prime ministers since Narasimha Rao in 1990s investing diplomatic capital on the US. And you also saw the result of uh, even during the Cold War, when the relations were not very great, what was happening was India's talent was going in the US. So the whole Silicon Valley architecture that was created, the emerging tech that is now coming up, in the US, that became a symbol of Indian presence in the US, and you started seeing that how that is impacting today's geopolitics, and so that relationship became very very critical. Two aspects here that I wanted to touch upon. One is the U.S.-India civil nuclear arrangement that came under George W. Bush's tenure, where an exception was carved out for India, and India was given a member of the given membership of the high-end technology regimes, in the sense making India part of the global nuclear architecture in ways that was not possible because India is not part of the NPT, and therefore to make India that to bring India into that fold was very important from America's perspective, because that was seen as from India's point of view one of the issues that was critical in bridging the trust divide. For India, it was critical that India becomes part of the high end technology regime's architecture that America had specifically created during the Cold War to target India, because India was the one that was challenging the non-proliferation regime, and therefore the sanctions that were imposed on India, and the way India was kept out of a number of these regimes. That as America started moderating its stance, and as the nuclear deal came into being, and the post-nuclear deal effect came into being, we saw how that last Rubicon was also crossed. That ultimately, U.S. and India today engage on nuclear questions. India is part of the India has access to the high-end technology regime globally, and that meant that India can participate in the global nuclear and high-end technology order, which was something that was not possible before for India. Now, that has that elevated um, India-US relationship, because that took away the last vestige of what many in India saw as a problem created by America to marginalize India in the global technology order. And the result of that you see today when India and the US are talking about high-end technology bilaterally. So if you look at the most important dimension of US-India relationship today, it is the emerging and critical technologies. And that meant that those technologies which at one point were part of divergence, they are allowing the two countries to come together and work on areas where perhaps the geopolitics of tomorrow will be shaped, or not tomorrow, today's in fact will be shaped. And that, I think, in some ways is very, very significant. You also see some of this convergence in the way um, Biden's term evolved. When Ukraine war started 3 years back, uh, there was a lot of challenge for India. There was a lot of concern about how India will navigate this, because on the one hand, India had to manage its relations with Russia. On the other, the US and the West, they were demanding that India take certain steps vis-a-vis Russia, and India was categorically not interested to antagonize Russia for various reasons, for historical reasons, for defense reasons, for India wants to continue to have that engagement with Russians. Now, initially, it looked very, very difficult. How will that balancing act go? But if you look at today, what has I mean, if you look at the end of the 3 years, India has navigated that very, very carefully and deftly. And despite India not towing Mr. Biden's line on Ukraine, India managed to not only have a relationship with the US, with Russia, but also managed to continue work with the Biden administration on a range of issues. So while there was some suggestions from Biden administration that India should not be doing certain things, when India continued to do those things, the pushback from Washington was relatively limited, because the understanding was that India needed that space to manage its relations with Russia, and India was able in the process to explain why India's dependence on Russia is so high. So a lot of the people in the West, for example, have been very critical of India's defense engagement. But the Indian response has been, which allowed them to understand India's perspective, was that it all started because India was denied high-end defense technology by the West during the Cold War, and therefore India's relationship with Russia is such that that relationship is not going to change in a short period of time. India is diversifying, but the diversification will take longer than many in the West anticipate. So, in a sense, the Ukraine crisis, which at one point seemed like a very serious crisis, also could not shake the foundations of the relationship. So, if you come to Mr. Trump, and if you think of Mr. Trump's first term, which was relatively more chaotic than what seemingly looks like his second term, if you go back to his first term, here the arguments more or less were the same. Make America great again, America first. But what he did in his first term was uh, something that many people believed when he had come would not be possible. And I think that was to change the discourse in the West on China. And I think that is very interesting. That for before Mr. Trump, largely the understanding in the West was that China may be a difficult partner, but China as a partner has to be managed somehow. And I think when once Mr. Trump came in, his more adversarial style of managing China initially was a shock to the system. But if you look at today's Western response to China, suddenly you saw that that response became the mainstream response. So today, when you look at European Union's response to China, how they have managed, how they are engaging China on trade, on technology, it is largely a copy of what Mr. Trump was proposing, and Biden administration continuing Trump 1.0's policies on China. In fact, hardening and accelerating the sanctions on China on the tech sector, and taking on China in many other areas. So in a way, Mr. Trump laid the foundations of the China policy for the West. He also revived what at that point in time was considered to be dormant Quad. So quadrilateral arrangement between US, India, Japan, and Australia that started off in 2007, but then it dissipated. Uh, Suddenly got revived under Mr. Trump in 2017 under Trump 1.0. So in a sense, what he was doing was he was reviving elements of his China policy, which he thought would allow him leverage in the Indo-Pacific. Uh, Trade, of course, remained, and he was targeting India on trade issues even in his first term. But we saw that targeting was relatively limited, despite him saying that India was a tariff king, etc. Uh, because largely the first term, was lacked discipline. It was more chaotic to an extent. Now, if you come to the second term of Mr. Trump, it seems that he hit the ground running from the first day. So the executive orders that he was signing immediately after coming to office on a range of issues uh, suggested that he was planning this for a while, and he was planning his second term. Now, in a sense, for the biggest issue for India uh, remains the economy and tariffs issue. Reciprocal tariffs, he reminds India every day and other countries every day that they are coming, and that they will have to be worked out. There is also immigration in this term, which is a very, very serious issue. And of course, there is this issue of Indo-Pacific, and there is this issue of Ukraine. So, in a sense, for India, uh, there are a range of issues in the second term of Mr. Trump, uh, which uh, which have the potential to derail the momentum in India-US relationship. Now, what Mr. Modi did with his recent visit to Washington was basically move first so that he and Mr. Trump can lay out the framework for the next 4 years. Because one of the most important things one can do with the leader as volatile as Mr. Trump is that you bring in some predictability to the engagement. And I think to the extent that it is possible with Mr. Trump, the visit of Mr. Modi has allowed certain framework to be built around which the specifics of the relationship can be managed over the next 4 years. So, for example, the tariffs issue. Now, one of the things that on tariffs, India and the US have agreed to do now is to say that we will talk about a bilateral trade agreement. And Mr. Trump wants that BTA by the end of this year only. That it should be fast tracked. So, in a sense, what India is telling Mr. Trump that look, we are willing to engage with you on tariffs, but it can't be piecemeal. It has to be part of the larger bilateral trade agreement, and that trade agreement will have to be concluded by the end of the year. But it also brings to the fore India's uh, uh, ability and willingness to buy certain key products from the US. And two products are important. One is, of course, gas, oil and gas. That Mr. Trump has said that energy is very important, and I will, his drill baby drill idea that America would become a market leader in oil and gas, which means that America will be producing much more of this. Which means that he will need new markets, and India has an appetite for oil and gas. So India has made an argument that it is willing to buy more from the US. The other is the defense sector, where India certainly needs more capacity, where India is saying that we will consider, of course, buying more from the US. India already buys significantly from the US. Now he has dangled, for example, F-35, that we have F-35s, and I don't think that is going to be that easy because India's uh, processes are quite cumbersome. But what I think the idea here is that India will be in the market. India will be looking at American products carefully, and India's engagement and India's power in the global defense markets, resource power, gives India certain leverage. So it's part of a bouquet of issues and that India is trying to bring together. That it is not simply about one issue or one sector. It is about a pan-sectoral engagement with the US. So I think this was this could have only happened if Mr. Modi, with Mr. Modi's visit, this could not have been sorted at the bureaucratic level. So we are looking at I think broadly and a framework in place which will allow now India and the US to work together going forward and delving deep into specific issues. On Ukraine war, it is slightly interesting that if, for example, Mr. Trump is able to bring the war, at least the active phase of war, to a close, then it removes one of the irritants in India-US relationship, which is the Russia factor. If Mr. Trump is dealing with Russia as an equal, then it puts India, it makes life easy for India because India doesn't really have to choose. If America is dealing with Russia directly, then there is no problem in India dealing with Russia directly, because that was not happening in the past. And there was pressure on India to not to do certain things with Russia, which obviously will not happen. In any case, India's position on Ukraine war was that war is serving no one's purpose, and Modi was perhaps the only foreign leader to tell Mr. Putin in public that this is not the time for war. So, in a sense, Ukraine and Russia, if the active phase comes to an end and there is some sort of a peace process that begins, it's going to help India. I think the biggest unknown for India at the moment is the China question, and how Mr. Trump would deal with China. He has given mixed signals on China. He has appointed people like Marco Rubio to his administration, which have very strong anti-China credentials. One of the first things that happened after his inauguration was a meeting of the Quad foreign leaders, and he has talked about reciprocal sanctions. But he has also said that he's willing to work with Xi Jinping to solve global problems. So once Xi Jinping and Trump have a meeting, what kind of a global roadmap they create for themselves would also have an impact on India, and India would be watching that carefully. So I think broadly, if you look at it, uh, it you know, there are many who in India who feel that this is this, it might not be that difficult to manage Mr. Trump, but certainly challenges will continue to come because Mr. Trump's volatility and lack of predictability is the biggest factor in shaping, I think, in any country, for any country's response. And India would also be responding and can only respond piecemeal. There is no overarching framework in that sense, because the framework for bilateral negotiations has been laid out by Modi and Trump. But beyond that, on a day-to-day basis, how Mr. Trump relates to individual events, individual issues, individual geographies, individual leaders, that is something that is beyond India's control. So India, like other countries, will also have to deal with one day at a time. And I think that will be the story of the Trump presidency for the next 4 years. And India-US ties, therefore, in the age of Trump, are likely to give us some surprises because in the last 2 decades, for example, we have not had very many surprises on India-US front. As I started this discussion saying that the relationship largely had been insulated from disruptions. The relationship largely had been insulated from significant shifts. There has been a persistent upward trajectory in the relationship. Now, with Mr. Trump, there is certainly greater volatility, greater uncertainty in certain sectors. And that meant that Indian diplomacy will have to deal with Mr. Trump one day at a time. I will just end there and we'll be happy to hear from you, your thoughts, observations, questions, comments. Anything. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hirsch, for an enlightening and informative presentation. It addressed many queries, but it raised many questions as well. So therefore, now I open the floor for the interactive discussion with you in this question answer round. Um, if anyone have a question, please. Yes.
Uh, Thank you very much, Professor Harsh. It was very enriching discussion. Taking advantage of your presence, first of all, let me introduce myself. My name is Nabila Jafar, and I lead a research program on China. Um, Taking advantage of your presence, I would like to know the future of India and China relations, with respect that their relations have been plagued by complex and evolving interests. And these kind of dynamics we witness at the multilateral organizations as well. So, what are the major convergences and divergences between India and China in some important multilateral organizations such as BRICS and SEO, and how these dynamics influence India's relations with USA? Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. It's a big question. Uh, See, India-China relationship, it has been going through a lot of they have been going through a lot of ups and downs for the last, particularly since 2020. We have had a stasis in the relationship. The relationship was perhaps at its lowest in, after what happened in the border, and since then, India made its position very clear that it will not engage China substantively unless China restores status quo ante along the border, which existed before March 2020. Now, in October last year, the two sides finally agreed to come to an understanding. And basically, what happened was that, basically what we saw was China agreeing with with India's stance on going back to the status quo ante along the border, and India agreeing to start the process of engagement at the political level. So. In a sense, there is greater optimism today about India-China relationship than it had been for a while, and I think in an interesting way, one of the uh, drivers in this is Mr. Trump and the possibility that Mr. Trump might come back to power, both for China and for India, meant that the two had to figure out for themselves how they deal with each other. Because again, for if there is no guarantee for India that Mr. Trump tomorrow might strike a deal with China, there is also no guarantee for China as to how far Mr. Trump might go in challenging the fundamentals of China. After all, as I was mentioning in my remarks, he's the architect of the anti-China policy that the West now is following. So broadly, India-China relationship getting back on track to some extent. I would not say it is everything is fine, but to some extent, and getting out of the the downward trajectory that it was continuing since 2020, that had to do with Mr. Trump. Now, there are many who argue that, look, there are convergences now emerging in the way Mr. Trump is reshaping the global order. So if you look at climate change, for example, India and China together, both of them have very ambitious green targets. Now, Mr. Trump is saying, "I will have none of it. I don't believe in it. I don't buy it. I'm not working with, UNFCC. He is getting out." So the point is, can bigger countries other than the US, like India and China, who have a stake in this, can they lead the process? So I think recently we saw some engagement between China and India at the multilateral level in that regard, at both trying to work through and see what they can do. There is also, if you look at Mr. Trump, he's withdrawing from a range of global institutions. He is withdrawing global aid that America provides. So whether you have other countries that can fill that void, and whether there are convergences there, but that is something that India and China will be working out as they also look at Mr. Trump. So it is not going to happen, uh, uh, you know, uh, in one direction. It is going to happen by looking at what Mr. Trump is doing. So there is going to be a very interesting phase in India-China relationship going forward. Because there is the third element which you mentioned, like BRICS and SCO. There is an element of Russia there. Now, Russia itself is now trying to work out a bargain with Mr. Trump. I think one of the things, and we saw, I think, the day before yesterday, Xi Jinping having a phone call with Mr. Putin. Now, I think Xi Jinping is also worried that if Trump manages to do a reverse Nixon, that is, if he is able to wean Russia away from China, that might make China perhaps most. I think everyone is worried, and one can also look at it as a tribute to Mr. Trump's diplomatic finesse, that he has been able to keep countries on tenterhooks. But I think the fate of BRICS SCO is also now contingent on what happens between Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin. And the ability of India and China, therefore, to manage a platform like BRICS or SCO between themselves without Russia will be very limited. So, in a sense, India, and China will also have to decide what kind of a relationship they are going to have with Russia, uh, given that Russia itself is being wooed by Mr. Trump, or or there is a possibility. Now, these are all very early days, but I think in some ways the convergences that India and China seem to be developing in the age of Mr. Trump, they perhaps are a response to issues, to themes, to challenges here and now, rather than a long-term strategic challenge. I think it is more a response to how, as I said in my remarks, how do you deal with Mr. Trump on a day-to-day basis? Because they, in some ways, are not a response to the larger structural shift that they view from their side. They're dealing with, I think both of them are more interested in how can they manage each other in the age of Trump. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Harsh. My name is Imran. I am a research analyst at this Institute of Research Studies. First of all, I would appreciate your candid representation, candid presentation. Uh, in, when my colleague told me that she has invited Dr. Harsh from India, Observer Research Foundation, so I just quickly went to the Google and I searched your article and started reading. So one thing I found very interesting that your analysis, especially your articles in the foreign policy, I found you very articulated and very candid and sometimes critical against Indian policies, which is something not new normal in India. In Pakistan, we usually have been very critical to what Pakistani government is doing, but this is something not new normal in India. So I found your article very balanced and neutral in that sense. So uh, coming to my question, uh, it is largely believed in Pakistan that uh, India needs United States uh, support in particularly in the larger recognition of the global world order and also leading position in the global south. So what's your take on it?
Thank you. See, I first of all thank you for your kind comments. But I think India, there is a very interesting diversity of views in India. You will find um, I mean, whatever the impression might be outside, if you pick up any Indian newspaper, out of four articles, one article would be very critical of Mr. Modi. So I think the debate remains very vibrant. But I think on the matter of you know the relationship growing and relationship India-US relationship growing on based on what reasons? Uh, Certainly, one of the reasons has been that without American support, a lot of things would not have been possible for India. So, if you go back to 1990s when India was opening up, and India was economically down, and India was trying to restore its economic profile, it would not have been possible without American support. It was the unipolar moment in international politics. Soviet Union had disappeared virtually overnight, and there was no other power other than the US. So I think shifting from a position where India and the US were on the opposite sides of the spectrum during the Cold War to one where India's need for America was very visible. India did what it had to do in terms of putting its economic house in order, and with American help, perhaps ensuring that the engagement with America continues to a level where it allowed India to stand on its own feet. Now you can also have a situation where India would have taken American help but not put its own house in order, which would have meant that India would have been in a similar position. So I think a lot of this has to be both ways. Today, if you look at why America, there is a big support. I was mentioning George W. Bush administration. So this was in 2000, right? 2000 he comes to power when he starts and Condoleezza Rice talks about balance of power. Now from 1990. when India was an economic basket case, to 2000, when America is looking at India as a country that can shape the balance of power in the region. Within a decade, you see a situation where India had turned around its economic house, where India was being looked at as a country that can potentially shape the balance of power. And therefore, it could not have been one way. So it could not have been that America was helping India, but India was not doing anything about itself. The other issue became that for America, India's support today is critical and crucial because they also believe that India has something which is needed. Otherwise, they have partners. They have treaty alliance partners in the Indo-Pacific, for example. Now they have Japanese, they have Australians, they have New Zealand, they have even Philippines and Vietnam. They are very close partners. But India is not a treaty alliance partner. So I think what India is bringing to the table is very, very interesting. It is that India will not be a treaty alliance partner, and there is no support in India for entering into a treaty with the US. I don't think Indian politics supports that, but it's a partnership where India can also defy at times what Americans want. So when Americans were pushing and saying, what are you doing with the Russians post Ukraine, India could stand up and say, well, you did not give us any weapons, Soviet Union did. So therefore our strategic autonomy demands that we will continue to engage Russians because it's critical for our security. So you have a balance in the relationship, which I think has allowed India certain leverage over the Americans. Unlike Japanese or unlike Australians, I don't think Indians or India can be treated in a way that would explicitly undermine Indian security, because Indian security is not being underwritten by the Americans. It is being underwritten by Indians themselves. So in a sense, there is a shift, because Americans also believe that India on its own has the ability to not only to support itself and its own security, but also provide a semblance of stability in the region, which India in any case is doing. Given India's relations with China, India is in itself trying to have relations with, for example, Southeast Asian countries, uh, East Asian countries. India has relationship with ASEAN, so which is independent of what India has with the US. It has nothing to. In fact, the reason why a lot of the Southeast Asian countries look at India is because they don't want to be in this binary of China and the US. They feel very uncomfortable with that binary. So they feel that India gives them certain leverage, with certain diversification, which is important for them. So I think the balance in the relationship is because India has been relatively independent minded in its approach to the US. Of course, US has helped India in critical ways, both in the 1990 economic times, then in the nuclear deal, as I was mentioning. Without American support, that nuclear deal and India's integration into the global economic nuclear order would not have happened. So there are very specific issues on which America has helped. But India, despite that, and I think that's credit to the Americans, they've also that they have not asked India at any point in time that, look, we are giving you this, so why don't you become a treaty alliance partner of the US? There are questions that are often asked in Washington, that will India stand with America at times of critical security threats? But American officials have never demanded that we will help you here, if you sign a treaty alliance relationship with us, or if you enter into a treaty alliance relationship with us. So I think the relationship has survived ups and downs, partly because of this independence, that India has been able to carve for itself in the relationship.
Thank you very much for a comprehensive explanation. Thank you.
Hello, Dr. Harsh. I would first like to thank you for your insights. Um, my name is Alina Shah, and I look after the Afghanistan program here at IRS. My question to you would be more general in context, but I wouldn't mind if you do go into some specifics. Observing the growing alliance between India and Afghanistan, the economic, political, and high profile diplomatic meetings in the recent past, does Trump coming into power have any kind of impact on the relationship?
Uh, See, I think India-Afghanistan ties initially under when the Taliban had come back to power, they were relatively limited. Now I think there is an attempt to expand those ties with some diplomatic activity happening there as well. but they are still very limited in the sense that the economic base is very, very limited compared to what it was before, say, during the period of the non-Taliban governing structures there. And I think initially when the Taliban had come back, there was a sense that India and India's position might be marginal. India would not want to continue with its engagement. But I think what we have seen is that given the relationship between Taliban and Pakistan. The Taliban government in Pakistan at the moment, Taliban itself has also reached out to India in a significant way. So there are some combinations that are emerging there, which perhaps we may have to look more carefully at. But at the moment, I don't think there is a significant investment being made, as significant perhaps as was made during the earlier government, uh, the earlier democratic government. Now, whether Trump has an impact on it, I don't know. I think uh, Trump is largely, has shown more interest on a range of issues. For example, even on Bangladesh, he has not shown any interest. He has not shown any interest on Afghanistan also so far. He has talked very, that I think he has bigger fish to fry at the moment with Russia, China, Ukraine, and Middle East. But I think if and when he comes to Afghanistan, it might be that his engagement and whatever we understand of him, he likes to deal directly with the top leadership. So I'm sure that he will also, in the case of Afghanistan, deal with the Taliban leadership directly. And there, he will certainly ask these questions as to who are the partners, who is engaged with. And I think India, China, and other countries, regional countries, all of them are engaged with the Taliban government at the moment. So that might give America also, some flexibility and some space to come back into Afghanistan. Now, I don't know very much as of now as to what the engagement is happening. But I think it's very limited as far as India is concerned. India is certainly trying to have a better understanding of what is going on, because after Taliban came back, there was a period when India had completely withdrawn. I think that period is ending. India's engagement is growing, but whether it is substantive enough to make a difference on the ground, that I'm not so sure about.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Harsh. I have like one or two questions, and then with that, we'll wind up this event. Apne naam? Okay. India has always taken a pride in their independent foreign policy approach. And while they are engaging with the major powers in the past decades, how far, as US strategic partner, the US would be willing to adjust and accommodate towards India's strategic autonomy, and which obviously gives precedence to the Indian national interest against US. We see both the leadership in India and US as more populist or nationalist who talks about America first and India first. Do you see any limitations or challenges or opposition to such, ideas between US and India? Thank you.
Yeah, see, that uh, has always been a big issue for India. That how far can India go with the US, uh, despite holding the fort on the strategic autonomy? That that we, as I was mentioning earlier, that India will not be part of a treaty alliance framework with the US, and will continue to operate depending on its own assessment of its interests, and still continue to manage its ties with the US. With big powers, it's always a difficult difficult balance to strike. Now, I think so far India has done well. India has done okay. and America has given India that strategic space because I think one of the things that Americans have realized, seems to have realized, is that if Indo-Pacific is going to be the theater of strategic competition going forward, then the older alliance framework that they had, where you had three or four close alliance partners, that is unlikely to help America manage the region. There they need all kinds of different partners, and not all partners will agree to the same framework. A lot of the frameworks that came about in Asia after Cold War, sorry, after the Second World War, they came in a particular context. They came in the context of the post Second World War order. So to expect that that order has continued and that would allow, that then that framework would continue and that America would be allowed that similar kind of a framework with other countries. That's a that's a misunderstanding of the emerging realities. So I think Americans have also adjusted to this new reality. Americans are also saying that, look, we want partnerships of substance. And I think the other thing is that the disillusionment in the US with the existing partnerships, particularly if you look at Europe. Now, we are looking at the whole debate on NATO, and I think there is a real concern in the US that, look, America has been the guarantor of security for Europe for so long, and European countries, despite being some of the richest countries for the last post Second World War, in the post Second World War period, have not been able to develop capacity to fend for themselves. Now, I think that certainly is a much greater challenge than managing a country like India, that with all its problems, at least when it comes to the crunch, it can stand up for its own security. We don't, I mean, even when the Chinese are creating problems along the border for India, Indian soldiers can manage the border problem on their own. We are not asking American troops to come in and help us. We are not asking Western troops to come in and help us. So, in that sense, I think the fact that India can stand up on its own is a good marketing tool for India, and is a good assessment of Indian capabilities, which perhaps Americans need more than the traditional hub and spoke alliance frameworks that they have that they had created in the post Second World War phase. Now, but I think for any country, including India, this will always be a big question to consider as to how far can you go. What kinds of when will be the time when there will be a red line for the US. When you keep on saying no, 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 and when Americans will say, well, what kind of a partnership is this? So you will always have that problem, but that problem has not yet emerged, and India has, and I think there was a real challenge during the Ukraine war, but it again India managed to uh, use that also and move forward. So I think going forward, looking this question of strategic autonomy from India's perspective is certainly going to be vital, because India, certainly in India domestically, there is a lot of support for it. And for the US, how do you accommodate that strategic autonomy strain in India in its foreign policy relationship with India is going to be an important consideration as it moves forward. And particularly, I think under Mr. Trump, we might see some of that interesting dynamic to emerge over the next 4 years.
Thank you so much.
I just wanted to ask a very quick question related to the first question that I asked you. More or less, you have already answered this question. I just want to ask a specific in that sense that since the US and India are collaborating on many fronts, so it has been said or believed in Pakistan that United States wants India to be a net security provider in the region. So, what's your comment on that? And secondly, it has also been said many a times that India is receding from its no first use policy. So your comments on that.
See, I don't think net security provider is a word that is used anymore in Indian context. Indians, I think policymakers are increasingly using the word preferred security partner. So I think there is a difference where a net security provider has a certain top-down context to it, which I don't think Indian policymakers are very comfortable with. So I don't think you will hear this word very often. You will hear a preferred security partner, that you have partnerships with your neighboring states, and if India can emerge as a partner which countries prefer to engage with, then that is something that India would like to make a case for. On no first use, I think there is a there is a significant debate that has emerged, but I don't see any move in the short to medium term to get it changed, or that it will change. I think no first use will remain intact, uh, but there are those who are questioning it, and I think uh, the challenge will come not so much from the regional context, but from the global context, where we are going to see a shift in this nuclear posture of major powers. And I think now that Mr. Trump does not believe in non-proliferation and disarmament initiatives, and America is likely to withdraw from a lot of them. He's talking about the Russians and the Chinese and others, direct engagement on that. I don't think it's going to go anywhere, and you will have American expansion along with Chinese expansion, which will dramatically alter the global context in which other powers operate. So I think no first use or lack of, or a change of it might come under pressure because of that. But I think at the moment we are not seeing any move towards ending it or changing.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Harsh. Just last few questions which I would club in. How far do you think we keep on talking about the Indo-Pacific and Quad and all the future partnerships? How far India is committed to the US vision of rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific? To what extent threats from rising hegemony of China do you think are real for India? And the defense engagement between both the strategic partners, US and India. Do you think what impacts you foresee in terms of regional strategic balance? Thank you from my side then.
See, I mean, the whole. I mean, I'll start with the second issue because that is the frame around which the others matter. I think I would not say. I don't know whether that's hegemony or not, but rising power and capabilities of China are certainly a challenge. And you use the word real. India lost 20 soldiers in 2020, so it is very real. I think that the challenge is not only real; it is immediate. That you have a rising China, which is building capacity along the border, where India's capacities are still limited compared to China's. And that means that if you don't have a balance of power in the border areas, it is a real challenge for India to manage. The challenge is also real in the sense that if you have a rising power like China, which is expanding its naval capabilities in the border, in the maritime space, then its ability to project its power and influence across the region expands, and that puts other countries in the defensive. So just as Southeast Asian countries are feeling the pressure, India is also feeling the pressure. I don't think there is anything new or distinct about India's pressure, but because we have a contested territorial border, it manifests differently. Whereas for the ASEAN countries from Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, it manifests differently. So there are two different ways in which perhaps this is being manifested, which means that India will have to invest on two fronts. India will have to invest in partnerships with like-minded countries, and this brings you to India-US defense engagement. That we are going to see more of that defense. We have seen that defense engagement grow, and we will continue to see that defense engagement grow in the future as well. And but not only bilaterally, but also regionally, which is what you said about Quad. That Quad, in a way, is a reflection of this reality. Two kinds of realities. One, that Indo-Pacific as a region does not have uh, an institutional framework which can manage the changing new realities on the ground. And Quad represents one way of approaching it, which is bringing like-minded countries together to talk about secure. I think the attempt in the Quad has been to make it less securitized and more about non-traditional issues. But eventually, security will come in because everything is today is securitized. And Indo-Pacific, therefore, is one of the key theaters in which this will be operated. So while America and India may have differences in the way they look at the geographical expanse of the Indo-Pacific, I think America's definition of the Indo-Pacific is different from India's. India's goes all the way from east of Africa to Oceania. America is from the Indian subcontinent to Oceania. So there are differences there. There might also be differences in how do you manage some of these challenges. But I think the convergence is that you don't want uh, you don't want the stability in the region to be fundamentally shifted in favor of one country or in favor of any single entity. And I think that is what brings them together. That is what brings a lot of the other countries together. And that is also what makes this region complicated, because as we know, China has a different vision for the region. So you have differences in the very articulation of what the region means, of how the region should be governed, and what potential collaborations among like-minded countries can potentially achieve. So with that, I think you can easily assess that there are divergences among key players in the region, which will manifest themselves in ways that at times can be highly challenging for countries in the region. And I think that is what India and some of the other countries perhaps in the region would want to avoid.
Thank you so much. Thank you once again for being so candid and very open and comprehensive in your responses and in your, overall of the Indo-US relationships. It was really an enriching experience and learning for us all. I'm very grateful and humbled because you were willing to speak with us, even though you were not well. Thank you so much from my side, from this institute side, and if possible, we will have further engagements like such we had today in future, inshallah.
Thank you very much. Thank you for
Thank you
having
so
me,
much.
and good luck.
Thank you so
Bye
much.
bye.
I think there
Hello.
must be a big
Round of applause. Thank you so much.
Well, that's very kind of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a nice day.